In your bio, it was mentioned that you split your time between Vancouver, British Columbia and Colima, Mexico. Can you tell us how this came about and perhaps some more about Colima itself? Because like me, perhaps those tuning in are not as familiar with this Mexican city and state.
Well, if you visualize the map of Mexico in your mind, Colima is south of Guadalajara by about 3 hours by car. And Colima is Colima is between Manzanillo, the port of Manzanillo, and probably some of our listeners have been to resorts in Manzanillo. Manzanillo is a huge seaport, and Guadalajara. Unfortunately, Colima has been in the news quite a bit recently. It has the unfortunate distinction of having one of the highest homicide rates in the world. But when my husband and I bought a house there about 20 years ago, it was a very quiet, very peaceful kind of place. And we had been traveling, the two of us, riding the buses all over Mexico and exploring different parts of the country and different cities and different smaller towns. And we settled on Colima because it's a small provincial capital of about 200,000 people. And it has a lovely climate. It has a very benign climate in the wintertime. It's warm and sunny, and the weather is just monotonously lovely. And we were lucky enough to find a nice little house and close in the downtown area, about 8 blocks from the Zocalo. And we've spent every winter since then in Colima, except for 1 year during the pandemic. And we didn't go down because Mexico had a really hard time during the pandemic, and it was before the vaccine. The vaccine was developed, so we missed a year, but that's the only year we've missed. But it's a lovely town, and it's made us both very unhappy to see what's happened to it. But hopefully this year it will be peaceful and quiet. We're flying down on Sunday, actually.
Perfect. The setting for your previous novels was Venice. Can you tell us what inspired you to write about Venice and dig deeper into its history?
Well, I was captivated by the Jewish ghetto in particular in Venice. And it's just such it's just such an exciting and lovely city. And I'm glad that I had a chance to see it several years ago, because, like so many European capitals, it has become very crowded and very, very touristy. I think 20 million people or 22 million people a year visit Venice. But the history of it is very interesting. And the number of books written about Venice, and in particularly about the Jewish ghetto, are just, it would be impossible to read all of them in a lifetime. I was very taken with, there seemed to be a lot of built-in conflict, which is, of course, what you need for a novel. Built-in conflict between the Jewish community, the government, the city government in Venice, and the Papal States. And the ghetto, which was started in the early 1500s, was considered a safe haven for Jews at that time. And the population of the ghetto kept growing and growing and growing and expanding, and the houses were getting, they were subdividing the houses, and both horizontally and vertically. There was another island that was dedicated to the ghetto, and it just seemed like such an interesting and novel idea to have a group of people sequestered in the way they were, right in the center of town. When I say sequestered, I don't want to give the impression that they were imprisoned, because they weren't. There were gates. And the gates were closed at sunrise and opened at they were closed at sunset and opened at sunrise. And people were free to come and go during the day. And many Gentiles came to the ghetto to shop for secondhand goods. That was considered, the Jews were very restricted as to what professions they could follow, and money lending was one. So people would come and borrow money and pawn their candlesticks and that kind of thing, and buy secondhand clothing. And the Jews were permitted to engage in secondhand clothing as well. And medicine. There were, even then, there were many Jewish doctors. So I was quite intrigued by the history.
A Trial in Venice was published in 2017. Why the long wait before the Jazz Club Spy, if you don't mind my asking, considering the Midwife of Venice came out in 2011, the Harem Midwife in 2013, and A Trial in Venice in 2017?
Why the long gap? Oh, good question. I'm not entirely sure how to answer that question. I sometimes go off I sometimes start books and have to put them away for a while because the plot is not coalescing for me. So it was probably a situation like that. I've also been working on a contemporary novel for several years that is in fact set in Mexico. So I was probably moving back and forth between books during that period of time.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. I'll share a synopsis of the plot of the Jazz Club Spy for those listening in. New York City, 1938, at the height of the Great Depression, when President Roosevelt is fighting to keep America out of World War II, Giddy Brodsky knows she's lucky to have a job as a cigarette girl at a Manhattan jazz club. Nevertheless, Giddy dreams of being a somebody, an independent businesswoman, and opening her own store selling cosmetics. She yearns to lift her family out of the poverty-stricken Lower East Side and leave her grim tenement behind. Giddy and her family have lived in New York since they fled their Russian shtetl after a deadly pogrom in 1918. Even after 20 years in the United States, her memories of that night continue to haunt her. Yet Giddy is still focused on the future, until one night, on her way home from work, she recognizes one of the Cossacks who participated in the pogrom that changed her life forever. Determined to get answers and vengeance, she enlists the help of Carter van der Zalm, the chief commissioner of immigration at Ellis Island, who is hunting the same man. He suspects the Russian Cossack is involved in an assassination plot that will destroy American and Soviet relations. Soon Giddy is moonlighting as an informant for Carter, but when she finally tracks down the man they're both seeking, she comes across a shocking discovery, that changes everything she once held true. As you can see, there's a lot at stake for Giddy in this, at times a family story, at other times a love story, at other times a redemption story. How did the idea of the cigarette girl turned spy first come to you, and how did you go about researching this aspect of the story?
I wanted to set a book on the Lower East Side. I've always been interested in the Lower East Side in New York ever since many years ago. I visited the Tenement Museum on Orchard Street, which is a refurbishment of an old tenement building that was built, I think, in the late 1800s. And there are 3 different apartments that have been refurbished in the manner that they would have been in the 1920s and 30s and earlier. And I was always struck by the hardship of that, and the kind of the cauldron of so many different nationalities, so many ethnic groups living together with not I'm sure in perfect harmony, but living together in a reasonably civilized way. So I always wanted to write about New York. I was also very interested in the pogroms in Russia. and the Cossacks riding into small villages and so on. So the prologue of the book is Giddy at age 5 or 6 when she's in her little village in Russia, and the Cossacks ride into town and commence burning her village. And she is hiding in the frozen carcass of her grandmother's cow. And I guess you could say the novel kind of started with the carcass of the grandmother's cow. I always liked that image, and I usually start my books with an image of some kind, and then build from there. So that's the prologue, and then we're transported in chapter 1 to 18. We fast forward 18, 19 years, and Giddy is working as a cigarette girl. And originally, Giddy was working in a sweatshop. She was working in a factory, and the more research I did on sweatshops and factories in New York, the more I thought, it was just so depressing. It was just so hard. And yeah, I could have written about it, but I wanted to introduce some music and some more of a different repertoire of characters, not more interesting characters, but different characters from different walks of life. I wanted to give her an opportunity to have some social mobility, in the sense that she would meet not only other working class immigrant people, but also middle class and upper class people as well, which she was not destined to do in a sweatshop. It was pretty much a dead-end job, I think you could say. So I took her out of the sweatshops. The backstory was that she got fired from the sweatshop for being rude to the boss and trying to organize the shop into a union. So she got fired from that, and now she's working in a kind of a louche nightclub run by Jewish gangsters. And it's during the Depression. It's a part-time job. She's lucky to have it. Her best friend is a young woman named Hattie, who is also from a similar background. She's a Russian immigrant girl. She unfortunately contracted polio shortly after she arrived in New York, and she's crippled. But she has, as she says, when God took away the use of my legs, he gave me second sight. And so Hattie does shows in the nightclub. She does nightclub acts involving picking people from the audience and telling their future and telling their past. And Giddy helps her in different ways. Giddy does a little detective work for her, let us say.
How did you choose which elements to fictionalize in this book and which ones not to?
Well, I mean, all of the historical details aren't fictionalized. I tried to keep as close as possible to the buildings that existed at that time, and street names, and the way people would have talked, and which immigrant groups were prevalent on the Lower East Side. All of the characters are fictional characters. Oh, no, that's not true. Kaganovich, who was a Russian, who was the subject, I don't want to give too much of the plot away. Kaganovich is coming to New York from Russia. He's Stalin's right-hand man, and he is planning a trip to the US to borrow money and buy arms from the US to defend Russia against Germany. Kaganovich was a real character and a very, very nasty man, and was right-hand man to Stalin, and was instrumental in a lot of the genocides that were taking place in Russia at that time.
Your portrayal of Giddy as a strong female character with questionable judgment at times suits the character perfectly, in my opinion. Was this character inspired by an actual person or based on the character traits of people you know, or even parts of you? Readers want to know.
I don't really, I was about to say I don't really base characters on real people, but actually in this book, that's not quite true because I have based a couple of the characters on people from my past. Giddy is not based on anybody. I I just I just had a vision of a brash, kind of know-it-all, bullheaded, you know, keep getting up kind of woman or young woman. Um, as someone who was really fighting against a lot of odds. I mean, no education, no money, um, very little family support. Her mother um, is quite neurotic, let's say. Her brother is very young. Her father has left the family. She's trying to hold the family together as best she can. And yeah, she does make some bad decisions, but she is a woman of action. And she, uh, she just keeps soldiering on. And that's a quality I admire. She gets discouraged, but she never gives up. She's kind of undaunted.
I suspect we all have our favorite character in this novel. Which was your favorite to write?
I think the more intriguing, I guess in a way, the most intriguing character for me was Hattie, the psychic, because um, Hattie is it because it's quite undecided whether Hattie really has second sight or if she's a faker or if she's a little bit of each. And in the process, I've always been intrigued by, palmistry and tarot card reading and um, uh, psychic phenomena of various kinds. And I did a lot of research on it. Um, and I still haven't made up my mind. Um, in fact, I had dinner with a friend of mine the other night, and she said she went to a psychic who told her some absolutely riveting and very, very specific things about about her past. So um, sometimes I'm a believer and sometimes I'm not. Giddy is kind of in the same position. Sometimes she thinks Hattie is just the best and she knows everything, and other times she thinks she's a big scammer. So the reader is going to just have to make up their own mind on that one.
Okay, perfect. Hattie was one of my favorite characters personally, but I'd be very interested in hearing other people's point of view as well. Can you tell us a little bit more about Giddy's mother and how you wrote this character? Because she's quite complex.
Well, Giddy's mother is, she's very fragile. I suppose in modern terms, you would say she's suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Um, she she lost a child in Russia. Another child was, well, I don't want to give too much of the plot away, but she's basically left two children behind in Russia. Um, she was violently assaulted during the pogrom in her Russian village. She's married to a man who is very difficult, who is filled with rage and anger and takes a lot of it out on her. Um, and she is functioning, she has a lot of difficulty functioning in the world. And she is very frightened to leave the house. She's agoraphobic. And Giddy has a brother, Arnold, and the two kids act as, I would say, ambassadors between the outside world and Ma, as she's called in the book, the mother. And in spite of her fearfulness, and Ma is a terribly fearful person, in spite of that, she's very smart and she's very funny. She's able to make fun of herself. She's a catastrophist. And she does kind of remind me quite a bit of my former mother-in-law. Now that I think about it, she has she's never mastered English. She's not a linguist. She has tried going to night school and so on, but she just really can't. She can't master more than a few sentences in English. So she's very reliant on her children to help her. And at one point, Giddy says, they say in America that the children bring up the parents, and that's pretty much what Giddy is doing. She's helping her mother, and she's helping her brother, and she's an interesting combination of selfish and selfless.
I think it's interesting how she progresses throughout the novel and ends up being quite helpful to Giddy in her business. I found that quite fascinating. Now I see questions are coming in from the audience. Okay. So I will ask the first one. This is from Laura and Beverly. Can you give more of a sneak peek about your next writing project?
Oh, I see. Well, I was in Italy in September, and I did get the idea for another book. I've been floundering for a while, and I feel quite restless when I don't have a project to work on. And you have one book published, and it's kind of like your kid has gone off to college, and what do you do now? So I'm happy to say that I have a book that I'm working on now. I think it's going to be called The Foundling Wheel. And a foundling wheel, as some of you may know, well, there's one in a convent in Florence. It was a vertical cylinder that was inserted into the wall of a convent or a hospital. And women, usually young girls who had illegitimate babies, would go to the convent in the middle of the night, and they would place their babies in the cylinder and turn the cylinder so that the baby then faced the inside of the convent, and then ring the bell, and then the nun or the custodian would come and take the baby, and the baby would be looked after in the convent. So that's kind of the central premise that I'm working with on that. And it's going to be set in Italy in the 1400s. So I'm going back a little bit earlier in history. And it's going to be set in one of my favorite cities in northern Italy called Mantua. And it will revolve around an actual historical character, a woman named Paola Gonzaga, member of the ruling Gonzaga family of Mantua. And she was small, and she was hunchbacked. And being hunchbacked was an unfortunate hereditary trait in her family. And it's about her struggles with that, her struggles to find a baby, to not get pregnant, I haven't worked out the plot entirely, but that's the kernel of it, I think.
Sounds very interesting. So I will pass on to the next question. An anonymous attendee asks, what authors do you revere?
Revere. Oh, well, many. Maggie O'Farrell comes to mind. I think I've read The Marriage Portrait I think I've read it twice and listened to it on audio at least once. It's a wonderful novel. Hamnet is wonderful, also by Maggie O'Farrell. Hilary Mantel was wonderful. I was very sad when she died about a year and a half ago. She was just a fabulous historical novelist. Sarah Dunant, Dunant, wrote a number of good, wonderful books about the Borgia family. One was In the Name of the Family, and the other was In the Company of a Courtesan. Was In the Company of a Courtesan was set in Venice, and it was about a very gifted, very beautiful courtesan. And I revere her books. She hasn't had anything published in a few years, and I was just checking her website the other day to see if maybe, I don't know, there was a suggestion of something that was about to come to pass, but I didn't see anything. But I have my fingers crossed on her. She's still
Okay.
young.
Perfect, thank you. So the next question, an anonymous attendee asks, what 5 people would you like to dine with, dead or alive?
Oh, 5 people. Wow. Do I have to do the cooking or can I have it catered?
We'll let you
5
cater
people.
this time.
Okay, we'll have it catered. Well, Hilary Mantel would be great. Sandra Donut. Who else? I was reading about Georgette Heyer this morning. She's an old-timer historical novelist, and some of her books are being reprinted. Who else? Maggie O'Farrell would be good. Some of the there is a wonderful professor of history at the University of Toronto that I would include. His name is Nicholas Terpstra. And I was just rereading his book. He's written a wonderful book about workhouses in Florence and young girls, orphans who were brought up in, you would call them convents, I guess, but the difference between a convent and a workhouse was a rather slender difference in those days. And these are young girls who were impressed into the silk industry in northern Italy, which was a very, very lucrative one. Not for the workers, but for the merchants and, so those would be the people I would have.
Thank you. And another question, who is the most important woman in your life?
Most important woman in my life. Oh, that's an interesting question. My parents are long dead. I think my sister, I dedicated my book to my sister. My daughter, who lives in Toronto, who's a lawyer in Toronto, is very important. I have a number of very close women friends that I really cherish, and many of them are writers. And I usually have dinner parties once or twice a year. I try to anyway, and have everybody over for kind of a big potluck dinner, and we talk about writing. I mean, writing is rather a solitary pursuit until the time comes to promote it, of course, as now. And so to get together socially and with other writers and just talk about nothing but writing, and it's a very wonderful thing for me to have that community. It's very important to me.
Excellent. We have a question here, well, a comment from Kathy Schwinger. Great to see you. Thanks for the book. See you in the spring.
Kathy is an old classmate of mine. We went to high school together.
Oh, that's sweet.
Hi, Kathy.
The next question is, where did you get the idea for the Jazz Club Spy?
I think I got the idea for the Jazz Club Spy many years ago when I was reading an Annie Proulx short story that was set in South Dakota or maybe North Dakota, and it was about a man hiding in the carcass of a cow. And I don't know why do some things stick in your mind and other things don't. I have no idea, but this image always stuck in my mind, and I remember thinking, well, how could a child could certainly get into a carcass, But how big is a carcass anyway? And could a grown man really, really crawl into the carcass of a dead horse? These are the kinds of things that preoccupy me.
If this book were to be turned into a movie, who would you cast in this film?
As Giddy, oh, I don't know. Natalie Portman, maybe? I think it would have to be a Jewish actress. Um, oh, I don't know. Minnie Diver, maybe?
Yeah,
Don't know if they're, I mean, Giddy is about, she's about 25, 26. So might have to be someone a bit younger than those I've mentioned.
Can you give us your best piece of advice for prospective writers?
Yes, my best piece of advice is probably the same piece of advice I would give to anybody who was pursuing a very long-term goal, and that is cultivate persistence, focused perseverance. And the other thing I would say is learn to take feedback. I've been in several writing groups over the years, and many of the other writers in the group have been wonderfully talented and have written terrific stuff. But I can see that they interpret feedback as criticism, and they just want that first draft to be perfect, and a first draft is never perfect, and writing is rewriting. And to become a professional writer, you have to go over the same ground over and over and over again. You have to listen to, well, you don't listen to everybody, but those people whose opinion you respect. And you know what? If enough people say your dialogue is really wooden, or this description goes on too long, or you use too many adverbs, you have to take it to heart. You may think it's deathless prose, but you have to learn to accept. It takes a long time to do that. You have to be thin, you have to be pretty thick-skinned and realize that what is being suggested might or might not be helpful. And it's not a criticism of you, it's a criticism of your writing. And it's what somebody who is not inside your head, who is objective and probably very well meaning, thinks of your work, and accept it graciously.
And how have some of your previous work experiences helped you in this way, or have they helped you become thicker skinned or
Right.
with public speaking, or is there anything that you've
Well,
transferred?
being a lawyer makes you pretty thick-skinned, especially being a family law lawyer, because it's sort of part law, part therapy is basically what you're doing. So you do, I think, achieve some insights into the workings of the human heart and into the relationship between men and women. And I think, well, practicing law makes you quite persevering, because it's a long, arduous process to go to prepare for long trials, for example, which I used to do. It takes a lot of stamina. It takes good health. And I think the other thing I learned from the practice of law was research. Fortunately, I love hanging out in libraries, and I love doing research. And I think unless you do, you're probably better off not to be a historical novelist to begin with. What have I learned from other jobs? I was a waitress for a year and a half. What did I learn from that? I learned that I didn't want to be a waitress for the rest of my life. That was useful information. um, Working in a factory, that was probably the worst job I ever had. And that was just a nightmare. And that's why I had to get Giddy out of the sweatshop, because all I could think of was working at RF Communications in Rochester, New York years ago. And it was such a nightmare experience that I thought, why inflict this on a helpless fictional character?
So we have another question that popped up from an audience member asking, what zodiac sign are you?
Take a guess. Stubborn, persevering, Capricorn.
Capricorn.
Yeah.
That's a good one. That's a good one. My best friend is a Capricorn. There is some great old language use in the jazz club Spy. So this is another question from the audience. Do you speak any other languages?
Oh, I wish I did. I speak a little bit of Spanish, but really badly. I have almost no linguistic ability. I mean, I have some Yiddish vocabulary, but I can't speak any language except English. Even though I took French for many years in high school and for a year or two at university. But fortunately, I know people who have this ability.
So we've heard from other writers in the past that before submitting the final product of their book, they sent it off to a sensitivity reading. Did you do that with this book?
No.
Okay.
No, I didn't. I have a lot of difficulty with sensitivity readers, to tell you the truth. I don't know. I don't think we want to particularly open this can of worms of cultural appropriation and et cetera, et cetera. But I think people should be able to use the vocabulary that was prevalent at the time that their book was being written. And I think certain words, not that you deliberately want to offend modern readers, but I think it's a terrible mistake to read historical fiction and judge it by present standards of behavior and morality. Times were different. 50 years from now, people will look back on us and consider us, insensitive and horrible and misguided, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't believe in whitewashing history.
So speaking of history, there are a few aspects that you had to research, whether it be the opening scene of the book or Ellis Island and immigration. Which was your favorite sort of subtopic within the novel to research?
Well, I wish I could remember the name of the author, but there is a wonderful book on the history of Ellis Island. It's a great fat doorstopper of a book. And I very much enjoyed that. And I went to Ellis Island, and anybody who has the opportunity to spend some time in the Ellis Island Museum will be very, very well rewarded for that. They have a wonderful website as well, and if your family emigrated through Ellis Island, they have a search. You can search your family, and you can search various people, various members of your family, and you can find out quite a bit of interesting information when they arrived at Ellis Island, how old they were, what their professions had been in the old countries, the countries that they came from. Yeah. Very interesting.
So you did share a glimpse of your next project with us, and it did not have anything to do with Giddy. Do you intend to continue writing Giddy's story?
I don't know. I haven't. I have given it some thought. I think what I'll do is I'll see how this book is received, and if there seems I have kind of deliberately left a couple of openings in the book. A few little threads that I could pick up and weave into a sequel if there seemed to be a demand for it. I like her character very much, and I like that time period and the setting and so on. And the Second World War is about to break out. Of course, she's in takes place in 38, 39. The difficulty is that I think there are so many books, have been so many books launched onto the market in the last several years on the Second World War, that I'm a bit loath to add to that pile of books. So I'm ambivalent about it. I'm of two minds about that.
Perfect. I think that's all the questions that I have for you tonight, Roberta, but we did have a few questions from the audience already, and I will, of course, invite anyone who has a question now to ask Roberta while we have her here with us. So I'll wait a moment, but in the meantime, can you tell us what a typical day looks like when you approach a writing day? Do you have a set routine, for example?
I do have a set routine. I write in the morning. I have I like to get to I'm not I rise fairly early, and I sit in bed and I keep a diary, believe it or not, and I write or a journal, and I write in that. And I read in bed, read the news, read my emails, have breakfast, and I try to be at my laptop by about 10 o'clock or 10:30, and then I usually write until about 1:30 or 2. Um, I I'm I'm pretty wasted after that. I don't write much in the afternoon. I never write in the evening. Um, I use that time, if I still have the energy, to read research books or other people's novels. Um, I I think it is important to have a routine, to know that at a certain time you're going to be sitting in front of your laptop, whether you like it or not. I'm going to try something a little bit different with my next book, and that is, um, I started it in a notebook because I was in Italy at the time and I didn't have my computer with me. But I'm going to try. I was going to try writing a first draft in by hand. At the Vancouver Writers Festival, Lauren Groff spoke, and I always like to know other writers' techniques and what their work habits are and so on. And she is quite amazing, and she writes many drafts, up to 15 drafts. She writes all of them by hand, except for the last one, which she then sends to her editor. I was just amazed. I was just amazed by that. I do not see myself doing that. My handwriting is so terrible that I could never, I could never, I could never do it. But it is there is something relaxing and very soothing about a good pen and paper with a nice tooth to it, and sitting in bed with a breakfast tray and just writing away. And I'm looking forward to I'm going to Mexico on Sunday, and I have a very nice study in Mexico, and I'm looking forward to just sitting at my desk and listening to the hummingbirds outside and listening to the palm trees whistle in the wind and writing away.
That sounds like perfect inspiration. And can you tell the audience a little bit about the audiobook process, and if you were involved in the audiobook process for this particular book?
Well, first of all, I have to say I'm a huge fan of audiobooks, so I was delighted when Simon and Schuster, this is Simon and Schuster in New York, said that they wanted to do an audio. So I was very supportive and enthusiastic about that. My input was pretty minimal. They sent me little snippets of 5 different actresses reading not from my book, but just reading in general. And they asked me if I had a preference among the five, and I did. There was one that I thought would be more suitable than the other four. And that that was one contribution. The other contribution was that there are some Yiddish and Russian words in the manuscript, and they had a list of them. And they asked me to pronounce them. And as I said, not being a linguist, I went to a friend of mine, Brenda Yablon, who's Canadian, who's a dual citizen of both Israel and Canada, and also speaks fluent Russian. So I went over to her house with my audio memo or with my phone, and she recorded that list of words for me, and I sent it off to New York. And those are two fairly minor contributions to the process. I'm very much looking forward to it. My sister sent me an email this morning saying that Audible now has it, and I think they're releasing it. I think they're releasing it today, if I'm not mistaken. For readers in the States who have tuned in, I don't know, other than I know Kathy is in New York, but if there are other readers in New York or in the US, the publication date is December 5th in the States. New York isn't bringing it out until then. So if you go to Amazon now, it'll be a pre-order, but it won't be an order.
Okay,
yeah.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much, Roberta, for taking the time to speak with us about the Jazz Club Spy.
That was lovely. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And thank you, Roberta, and the best of luck on the rest of your book tour and on tomorrow's live event I see in Vancouver.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everyone.